Probably most people have never heard of Charles Landon or his mail-order cartooning school, but I bet they've heard of some of the people he taught. Carl Barks, the creator of Uncle Scrooge. Sid Couchey, the artist for Harvey Comics who worked on Richie Rich. Milton Caniff, the creator of Terry and the Pirates and Steve Canyon. Jack Cole, the artist who did Plastic Man. Roy Crane, creator of Wash Tubs and Buzz Sawyer. Floyd Gottfredson, who did the Mickey Mouse comic strip. Bill Holman, creator of Smokey Stover. Bill Mauldin, who did Willie and Joe for Stars and Stripes. Chic Young, who created Blondie. And Vince Hamlin, who created Alley Oop. These men had at least three things in common. They were all born between 1900 and 1921. They were all great cartoonists, and as boys, they all answered an ad that asked them to copy this sketch. The early 1900s saw an amazing confluence of 5 interrelated technologies and events which made possible a correspondence school like Landon's. First, the development of industrial printing presses. Steam-powered hand presses, invented in the early 1800s, could print up to 250 sheets a day, but the steam-powered rotary press, invented by an American in 1843, could print millions. This made possible the exponential growth of the daily newspaper. In 1850, there were just 2,500 papers. By 1880, that number had grown to over 11,000. By 1890, major newspapers were recording circulation figures of over 1 million copies per issue. The rapid growth of newspaper readership led to a demand for new content, including comic strips, that just couldn't be met. There weren't enough cartoonists available. Second, the expansion of an industrialized transportation system that ensured the timely delivery of mail. In 1891, the post office began to experiment with the free delivery of mail to rural areas, with 5 routes that covered 10 miles. By 1901, that had grown to over 100,000 miles, and by 1910, over 1 million. Partly this was made possible by the rapid adoption of the automobile. In 1900, Americans owned just 8,000 cars. By 1920, they owned 8 million. Third, the invention and rapid expansion of the home correspondence course. In 1891, a small mining company in Scranton, Pennsylvania, offered a single course on engineering that could be studied at home. By 1898, over 63,000 students were studying hundreds of subjects by mail, and the International Correspondence School was born. Fourth, the exponential growth of special interest magazines. Titles like Popular Mechanics, first published in 1902, offered content that appealed to specific demographics. Their low-cost classified ads allowed entrepreneurs like Landon to inexpensively reach a national readership of millions of young men and boys. And fifth, the rapid development and acceptance of the comic strip as a new form of entertainment. The Yellow Kid, one of the first full-color Sunday comics, debuted in 1895. Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland began in 1905. Mutt and Jeff in 1907. By 1910, every major newspaper had a section dedicated to comics, and by 1920, there were hundreds of comic strips available. All of these are interrelated. Without an industrialized printing press, there is no way to mass-produce newspapers, and thus, no demand for content. Without the demand for content, the comic strip, a brand new form of entertainment, doesn't have a built-in market to fuel its growth. Without that rapid growth, there is no demand for new cartoonists or a need to instruct them. Though some might argue that it was the growing success of comics that fueled the growth of the newspaper industry. Also, without an industrialized press, you don't have special interest magazines that cater to specific demographics. And without that, you can't successfully market a niche product like a cartoon school. Without industrialized transportation, you can't deliver millions of copies of newspapers and magazines on a daily or weekly basis. Nor can you deliver correspondence lessons regularly enough to make mail-order instruction practical. To take advantage of this confluence of events, you had to be in the right place at the right time, and Landon was. Landon began working in the newspaper business in 1900 when he was just 22 years old, when he got a job working as an artist for the Cleveland Press. Soon, he was art directing for the Newspaper Enterprise Association, one of the earliest newspaper syndicates, founded in 1901 by the owners of the Cleveland Press. One of Landon's jobs for NEA was to find and train talented new cartoonists. Many of his early students, including one of the first female cartoonists, were signed by NEA. Ethel Hayes, who drew Flapper Fanny Says. Merrill Blosser, creator of Freckles and His Friends. J.R. Williams, creator of Out Our Way. Edgar Martin, who drew Boots and Her Buddies. And Gladys Parker, who drew Flapper Fanny in the 1930s. Other early students were signed by NEA's competitors: Martin Branner, creator of Winnie Winkle; Gene Burns, who did the early comic strip Regular Fellas; Fred Naher, who created Doodads, Autowat, and others; Edwina Dumm, who created Captain Stubbs and Tippy and was also one of the first female editorial cartoonists; and Fred Locker, who created the early strip Cicero Sap. Mail-order art courses had been around since as early as 1894, but these focused on traditional art, mechanical drawing, or illustration. We don't see the first ads for cartooning courses until 1904. Landon's chief competitor, also based in Cleveland, was W.L. Evans, who started his correspondence school in 1907. Ads for Landon's course began the following year. The biggest difference between Evans' school and Landon's was Landon's creation of the picture chart method of drawing. It's apparent that earlier courses focused on traditional illustration techniques, like the study of anatomy and perspective. A 1903 book on cartooning relies on anatomy illustrations to teach cartooning. Construction of characters and action were almost always taught from the viewpoint of the artist's sketch. While other courses, including Evans's, used a step-by-step approach, no one emphasized the use of shape and line to define action the way Landon did. He seems to have pioneered the idea of combining an interior skeletal stick figure to define action, with circles and other simple shapes to define mass and form. The evidence for the popularity of Landon's techniques can be seen in their widespread adoption during the decades after 1908. Almost all of the post-Landon cartooning courses owe something to his school. From 1908 until his death in 1937, Landon constantly refined the contents of his mail-order coursework, but by 1920 he had developed the core lessons that would be used for the next 40 years. Pen and ink lines, with a focus on making lines that could be reproduced in newspapers. Drawing the head. Drawing expressions using cartoon iconography that was already well established. Hands and feet. The construction of comic figures. How to convey action in a static drawing. Drawing comic women. Foreshortening and exaggerated action. Shading, again using techniques designed to create lines for reproduction. How to draw kids. Comic animals. Perspective. Sketching, how to turn details from nature into cartoons. Caricature. Shadows. The comic strip. Symbolic animals and figures, used for editorial cartooning. 2 lessons on anatomy. Editorial cartoons. 2 lessons on composition. And finally, lessons on generating ideas, newspaper layouts, lettering, and drawing from photographs. Out of 28 lessons, only 2 or 3 might be found in a traditional art class. The rest represented a practical approach for drawing for newspapers. In 1909, a young kid, working from home, could become a famous cartoonist with nothing more than Landon's lessons, some pen and ink, paper, sweat, and a little talent. There's no question that Landon's school deserves far more recognition than it has received. In the very least, the Landon School of Illustrating and Cartooning deserves to be rescued from its current state of obscurity. Along with W.L. Evans, Landon practically invented the cartoon correspondence course, based on the sheer number of students who went on to successful careers in cartooning and related professions. There's no question that Landon School was the most successful and impactful. It's not an exaggeration to say that Landon School played an instrumental role in shaping the cartooning techniques that defined newspaper comic strips in the first half of the 20th century, and through his influence, the work of thousands of cartoonists working today.